So the last thing that I said to you was to prepare yourself for the next video where I'd be rebuilding this Evo 9. But that was before I learned a piece of devastating news about the Audi R8. Not specifically bad news about my R8, but bad news about the R8. When I almost crashed this car last week because the ball joint snapped, while I waited the tow truck, I immediately went on the internet and found the replacement part. Now, the internet's been a real game changer for DIY automotive repair, because before I even got that last video out, I already had my replacement parts. And this is where the story gets sad. You see, in 2008, every Audi R8 was a V8. But in 2009 model years and newer, all Audi R8s came with the option to have the V10 engine, the same V10 that they put in the Lamborghini. And with the beefed up engine, every Audi R8 then came with beefed up suspension. But here's my old R8 with the old unbeefed up suspension. Which means since 2009, Audi has only manufactured and sold the heavier duty part, the part that my R8 does not have. Which means every part that I buy for this car is the wrong one. Buy the V10, kids. So just to be clear, they don't make V8 parts anymore. The parts I need have been sold out for years. Nice, dude. Thank you.
I could grab a signature.
Absolutely. Thanks for hooking it up, as always. Thanks, man.
Last name, sir?
DeWald.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. My friends call me Gasket. The fundamental issue here is that you can't just buy one part because the old parts physically don't fit with the new parts. The right thing to do is to upgrade all of the suspension parts to the new V10 components. The problem is $11,867. So that's if you go buy the parts at the dealer. There are many people dismantling R8s on the internet, so you just gotta find one that has a similar build date as my car, and find one that has V8 parts. Replacement of a part like this is not very difficult. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts in the front and another 4 bolts in the back. You've seen these bolts a bunch of times. They're just these, I think they're called triple squares. It's a classic Audi bolt. Lamborghini too. Yes, this is the right length extension for this job. I mean, look, I could almost use another one. Why would I make the last bolt so hard to get to? There we go, that's out. So here's the two parts. This is the old one. You can see that thing took a whooping. Here's our new to us part. They're actually the same exact age. Remember, these parts were manufactured at the same time. Now you have to remember that these suspension components do help align the car. Take a look at that bolt right there. See how it's oblong shaped? That allows for built-in adjustments. So I need to take my old control arm and match that to the new one. It might not be perfect. It still will need an alignment, but do that off camera. With the alignment settings matched to our old piece, now we just gotta install this back into the car. Easier said than done, now that this one's not broken. And most importantly, torque everything to spec from suspension to the wheel before you drop this thing back to the ground. Oh, how I've missed you. We should be able to test drive the car now to make sure that the thing drives straight again like it did before I almost crashed it. Before we put it on the ground though, you just want to give it a good spin to make sure it's spinning freely. There is a bit of resistance because it's an all-wheel drive car, but overall, seems, oh no. What's that noise? When something in the suspension breaks and then you keep driving the car, or at least rolling it like 50 feet like I did, it's not unusual to have, man, I'm getting sick, or I'm just allergic to working on this car. It's not unusual to have collateral damage. So underneath the car, this is the wheel, this is the axle that powers it. Remember, it's quattro. Hear that? There shouldn't be any play in that axle. So my suspicion is I broke the axle under here when the wheel was tilted at such a harsh angle. When that wheel broke and it turned in really hard, it probably put an incredible amount of force on the CV joint at the axle. See, it's like a universal joint. Just inside of an axle and a drive shaft is a universal joint like this. It allows the wheel to be at any angle while the power source, the engine, stays at one angle. And you can keep powering that wheel no matter what angle that the wheel is at. The problem is my wheel went to like 90 degrees when I broke the ball joint, and then it just kept turning. And you can imagine the stress that this saw. It just failed, like everything, just failed. Kind of like my voice is doing. Like most approaches to fixing things, there are two ways to go about addressing this issue. The first is just to replace that universal joint that's making that funky noise. The second option is to take advantage of this unfortunate situation and do something I've always wanted to do to an Audi R8, and that's convert it to rear-wheel drive. Now I'm holding the rear-wheel drive conversion kit in my hand, which means the decision's already been made. Now there are obviously pros and cons to making an exotic car rear-wheel drive. But first remember, there are many high-end and high-horsepower cars on the road that are also rear-wheel drive. Porsche, McLaren, BMW, and even Lamborghini all sell a rear-wheel drive version of their flagship model. So this is not a revolutionary idea. It is a great way to shave over 100 pounds of weight from your car, which makes the steering much lighter and it makes the entire car feel more nimble on the road. For a four-wheel drive system that's 15 years old, it can remove a lot of the slop in the front end that's taking away from the driving experience. The only downside is you're removing 50% of world-class Audi Quattro technology that helps keep your car otherwise on the road. I know newer models had a temperature sensor and you have to unplug it, but this one's fully hydraulic, which means removing this entire front-wheel drive system will not lead to any fault codes, which is great. You wouldn't have that in today. Imagine today's vehicles. This whole system would shut down if I unplugged or disconnected the differential. Removing this long propeller shaft really only saves a few pounds and it's remarkably light. However, it costs $2,200 to replace. The front differential removes most of the weight off the front end of this car. It itself costs $6,100 to replace. Behind the front wheels, you find the bolts that hold your now useless front axles. Pulling them out saves a few pounds, whereas replacing them costs $1,700 each. So the only part that goes back in is this little axle stub. It takes the place of the old axle, but notice I'm taking out this gigantic, heavy axle, broken too, and replacing it with the axle stub. This is the aftermarket part. A couple $100 I paid for these a few months ago. I don't even remember. Seems like it was a great idea. I mean, we haven't done the conversion yet. Once we go on the first test drive in a few minutes, we'll know if this was a good idea. The conversion stub goes behind the front wheel, and the new bolt that they gave me sandwiches everything in place. All of the undercovers go back in place as to keep the car as aerodynamic as it ever was. And to the naked eye, you'd never know that this car is now much more exciting to drive, 100 pounds lighter, and just ever so slightly more dangerous. So this is the one time in my life it's okay to finish your project and have a bunch of leftover bolts that aren't going back in the car. We've all been there before, and I'm sure we'll all be there again. Let's drive it. All right, here goes first test drive since being stranded for 8 hours at a funeral home. If you know, you know. Just reviewing in my head, if I tightened all of the bolts, right? The wheels are tight, the axles don't exist. Steering feels nice and tight, but very light. Remember, the car already runs good. We're not worried about that. What I'm worried about is making sure it can drive without crashing it again. That was scary. So when it's all-wheel drive car, you can't turn the wheels all the way to the right or else it'll start binding up because the axles just can't turn that harshly. Smooth as butter now though, and with no hands, the car is tracking straight as well. You know, I was a little nervous. I get back into the car and feel nervous or anxious to drive it because of what happened before, but I'll tell you, this is the smoothest this car has ever driven. Minus the clunk. Couple things?
3 things, actually.
Cool.
I could grab a signature.
Yeah. That's it.
Thank you. And your last name?
DeWald. Okay, thank you. All right, sir.
Have a great day.
Thanks, have a nice weekend.
You too.
There's only one real concerning downside to the rear wheel conversion, and it's losing the Quattro technology. I want to keep this car on the road if at all possible. But I was doing some reading and I came across this old school technology to try and keep your car on the road better. Modern stability control technology relies on sensors, on modules, and on computer software to keep you between the lines. But let's not forget one physical force that we were taught from our automotive ancestors. I believe it's pronounced downforce. So this is the APR GTC 500 carbon fiber wing for the R8. It's 74 inches wide. And if you think it looks ridiculous on this car, don't worry. We're starting here and we're working forward. This car is about to get a glow up.
I paid a fortune for it. So the fit and finish on this wing is insane. Check out the weave, check out the hardware. If you see any blemishes on this thing, it's from my fingers. This thing is beautiful. To offset the cost, I'm gonna sell all the parts for my 2-wheel conversion. That's a joke, nobody buys those parts. What's not a joke is how you mount this wing to your car. Check this out.
And normally a wing would mount to a body panel like this, or in the R8's case, you can see people commonly mount it to the factory spoiler, but this is flimsy. With the amount of downforce provided by our new wing, we need better fixation. One of the first things you see when you pop the engine hatch, frame rails. With a wing this big, you can have hundreds of pounds of downforce pushing on the car. You don't want to be pushing through a flimsy mounted spoiler. You'd rather be pushing through the frame of the vehicle. You want to be able to transfer all of that downforce into the car so you stick to the road, and you do not want the wing flying off the back of the car. Especially if your wing might be worth more than the car that's driving behind you. This is the hardware that mounts our wing to our car. If we're gonna get technical, it's actually the hardware that mounts this plate to our car, and check it out. It's a solid piece of material. And where this plate fits is somewhere around here, but notice all those holes, no holes in the frame. So I'm gonna have to drill holes into the frame of the R8. And this thing here is a riv nut. Notice there are threads in this, and what you do is you drill the hole into the frame, place the riv nut into the hole, and then you have to use a very special tool to squeeze that rivet nut so that it doesn't come loose. It essentially rivets the nut to the frame. The good news is I do have a rivet gun. The bad news is this is useless to us. It just sounds like the right tool. It's the wrong tool. I need a rivet nut gun. In the modern age of online shopping, when I need a tool, like everything else, I've learned to go online and have it overnighted for the next day. This has worked great when I really needed a tool by tomorrow. But the problem with not having the right tool is it'll stop your entire project in its tracks, which is a real issue when you've taken the entire day off of work to finish the car you said you'd finish 4 months ago. To say I'm nervous to drive this car is an understatement, but I gotta get through that fear, and we gotta test it. What better way? Talk all the trash you want. If you need it, they probably have it. Just don't plan on using it more than once. The hardest part about coming to Harbor Freight is trying to limit your purchase to the single thing that you came here for, and getting out without spending 2 weeks' pay. A $20 rivet nut inserter, nothing else. Made it.
I've always wanted a first-gen Viper and a second-gen green four-door car, but I got one of these. Two really cool things. Number one, I found the rivet tool that I need, rivet threaded insert kit, and the Audi made it here, so let's just go home before something breaks. I wasn't sure if I was gonna show you this or not, and I don't even know if I'm gonna do it, but that's for sale. How cool would this be?
So this warehouse space is actually for sale, and I wanted to bring the R8 just to see what it looked like out front, because I know if I buy this thing, the warehouse that is, it's gonna be an ultimate decision, but I'll leave that at that. Part of me thinks having a warehouse would be really cool, but part of me thinks there's something about doing all this work I do in my little garage that makes it even cooler. What do you think? And I'd have to equate in driving now to this warehouse, which is only about 15 minutes from my house. So it almost makes too much sense, but at the same time doesn't make enough sense. That's where I nearly crashed last week. So the tool that I just picked up should allow me to mount this plate for the spoiler right there. I don't mind drilling holes in the frame because I'm gonna fill them with riv nuts, so they'll look kind of factory when we're finished. What I'm not thrilled about though is in order to mount that plate here, we have to cut a big hole in this engine cover. Yeah, I know I never cleaned it, but I never had a reason to. Before we start cutting those covers, it's wise to make sure the rear end's perfectly aligned and that the body panels fit before we start making cuts on $2,000 engine covers. Stand corrected, it's a $2,076 for the carbon cover. It's only $300 for my cover. It's still $300 that I don't want to cut into until we know everything fits right. And by fit right, I'm talking about our rear bumper. You can see it was fitting very not right before the exhaust completely fried the bumper and it chipped the paint. I've learned the hard way too many times. Never drill and mount new pieces to your car until you have all of the factory body panels lined up and fitting accordingly. This rear bumper needs the rear diffuser removed and set aside, as well as these exhaust shields, both of them. And the rear vents too, both of them. So check out how fried this inner skeleton is. This is totally ruined. The wiring harness is cooked. This will be my third wiring harness. And you can see the bumper itself is actually, yep, totally fried. Fortunately, I'm so cheap that I should have no problem convincing myself that we can fix this and that it doesn't need replacement. And honestly, if we replaced it, I'd probably burn up the new one anyway. I wish I could tell you how many times I've painted this rear bumper. My best guess is this is the 4th time I'm painting this bumper. You can even see the factory Audi white poking through. Because this bumper has so much paint on it, you have to sand off as much as possible. Too many layers of paint makes it prone to wrinkling and failing. Although that makes for great content, it's an otherwise complete waste of time. The other key to a good paint job is a quality decontamination, combined with a little bit of elbow grease. While I have the paint equipment out, it's a good time to restore the rear diffuser. You guessed it, it's lots of washing, it's lots of sanding, and it's lots of old paint. In order to prevent rain or bugs from ruining this paint job, I'll set up the poor man's paint booth once again, which has only proven to be nearly useless in the past. This is why I always buy extra paint. 4th time's a charm. Fortunately, I have just enough left to mess this paint job up 1 or 2 more times. It's a smooth, even layer of ice silver on the bumper, and the same on the factory door handles that I've never painted. And a bonus round of some leftover black Bentley Continental paint from a previous rebuild.
Here's what the paint job should look like. And here's where I ruined it. I can't make this up, so I'll start all over again.
5th time's a charm.
So I get to say something that I really rarely get to say on my channel. This is one of the nicest paint jobs I've ever applied to a body panel. And if you've ever watched me paint before, you know that that means a lot. Now, if you're listening closely, I just said something a few minutes ago that's not true. I thought we had to mount our rear bumper before we mounted the new wing. Before I read the directions, I was under the impression we would have to alter this old spoiler in order to mount the new one, but I was wrong. After reading through these directions, I realized we have to cut the rear deck lid, not the rear spoiler. When you install a rear bumper, it aligns with this old factory spoiler, so it would be really important to get that lined up before we start making cuts. But we don't have to cut the factory spoiler. We have to cut the deck lid, which is a much more significant commitment to this car and to this wing, but we're already committed. So if I don't have to mount this to the car right now, that decreases the likelihood that I'll scratch it while it continues to dry. Because remember, although I can touch this clear coat, it takes clear coat, I don't know, days, weeks, maybe even months to totally harden. So if I'm not fiddling with it on the car, turning wrenches around it, I'm not gonna ruin it. For now, we're not gonna ruin it. Instead, what we are going to ruin together is the frame of this R8. If I'm gonna ruin the frame of this car, I wanna cause as little collateral damage as possible. Applying painter's tape to the factory color-matched frame rails will make sure that I don't scratch any area that I'm not drilling into. Lord knows I don't have the track record to repaint it. The wing mount is placed about 7 inches from the end of the frame rail. It mocks up perfectly, and I use a Sharpie to mark the drill holes. Drilling is a 2-staged event. The first drill bit is about 1/8 of an inch and works as a pilot hole. Maybe new Milwaukee tools will arrive for Christmas. There's an important principle to follow when drilling holes in expensive cars. You want to make sure that no matter what you do, you don't go through the material that you're drilling and plunge into the expensive unknown below. Like that. Don't do that. Secondly, you don't want to put metal shavings into the intake. The second stage of drilling is a stepped drill bit. It allows you to upsize the hole with little effort and equally little precision. But with the tape removed, it looks like a clean result. Now it's time for the Harbor Freight tool to save the day. The rivet nut screws directly into the end of the rivet nut inserter tool. The nut fits precisely into my pre-drilled hole, and a sound, firm squeeze ensures that the rivet will only come loose for the next owner, looking like it came that way from the factory in Germany. This heavy-duty wing mount gets bolted directly to the rivet nuts that I just installed.
With the mounting plates directly on the frame of the car, any added downforce, upwards of hundreds of pounds of downforce from that wing, is going to be transferred directly to the frame safely. Older models of this wing mounted directly to this piece right here, which I think at some point is mounted to the car through some sort of adhesive. If the purpose of the wing is just to look good and there's not a lot of downforce, it's not a big deal, but if there's a ton of downforce or if there's a big gust of wind, we don't want that wing ripping off that panel of the car. The problem with the frame mounted kit is it's in the way from closing the hatch. That means we have to cut the hatch.
As much as drilling holes in the frame may have destroyed the value of this car, at least it could pass as a factory installed rivet nut. But cutting a chunk out of the factory engine deck lid, I'm not sure how factory appearing this is going to look when we're finished. The instructions don't clarify if I could use a razor blade to make the cut, or if we'd be better off with a Sawzall. Another thing they don't mention is what color you want your casket to be when you die in 5 years from advanced lung disease. This process produces an incredible amount of composite fiber dust. And a bonus, if you're careless like me, the cutting wheel is gonna blow apart in your face 3 seconds in. Good thing I have one backup. The razor blade cuts off the excess material, and the hatch now closes with irreversible damage to it.
So now it closes nice and neat. It does look like I took a little bit too much material here, but I think that's just because because I messed up.
The wing fits like a glove, and the only thing left to do is to make sure it doesn't fly off of the car when we drive away.
The only thing I can tell you about downforce is that it now appears that we have plenty.
A test drive really only has one purpose. Can you feel the difference with the wing on the car?
Wish you could feel this downforce.
The honest answer is no. Damn, does it look cool.
I'll be the first to admit the car kind of looks like something you would drive to high school, but that's sort of the point. I want to make it obnoxious so that it's really eye-catching. Of course, this is a YouTube build. It's supposed to look cool, and I'm honestly sort of just sick of building the same old car over and over again. And I do realize that in order to benefit from the amount of downforce that wing can provide, you'd probably have to drive like 80 to 100 miles per hour, and I'm not gonna do that. We're building a cool car, that's all that matters.
So with the car fitted to a GT3 style rear wing, and the rear wheel drive conversion completed, there's only one real place for this car to go from here.
You guessed it, it's finally time for a color change.